Werewolf is finally viable in in-game content, and I don't just mean a werewolf can get carried in a group. I mean, it looks like something that actually is going to get played in hard mode veteran trials. I got this exact setup to a little over 182k DPS, which is really just crazy for the little amount of time I spent learning and working on it. And that's not just for me to brag, it's just to show how easy this setup really is. I've seen parses at nearly 200k on this setup, so the damage is incredible. But the bigger deal is that the rotation is super simple. There's only one bar, so you have one spammable, 2 buffs, and 2 dots. That's it. So let's jump into the build. So Nightblade is the class that's pushing damage super high up, and it's really because of these class mastery passives, an eye for exploitation, and above and beyond. This one gives you 2,000 extra weapon and spell damage based on your target's missing health, so it's kind of like an execute. Your weapon damage goes up as their health gets lower. And then above and beyond, this increases your critical damage and also your maximum critical damage. So Nightblade is far and away the best class for werewolf. Of course, you can do werewolf on any class, but Nightblade is the best right now. DK follows after that, Sork after that, and then all the rest. But the damage drop off is pretty significant from Nightblade to the next. So I would highly recommend being a Nightblade for your werewolf. So as a werewolf, you do need pretty clean weaving because most of your damage is coming from light attacks. The light attack bleed is really strong, and the light attack damage is great. So you got to make sure you're hitting as many weapon attacks as skill attacks or close, and that you have a pretty decent weave average. That just means doing light attack skill every time. For the gear, I'm using Savage Werewolf. This has a special 5-piece that just applies to when you're in werewolf transformation. You gain 6% more damage, so it's really strong while in werewolf form. It's still decent when you're not in werewolf form, but you're not getting that extra 6% damage. That's 5 medium of Savage Werewolf, all divines on the body. Then I have Null Arca to be my Minor Slayer set. I found this to do just a touch more damage than Mora Scribe, but you do have to play around a little bit with the crit damage numbers. Like for this, I'm using Backstabber and running Null Arca. If I ran Mora Scribe instead, I might take off Backstabber for something else. While these are daggers, it doesn't really matter. If you swap these out for axes, you wouldn't get more crit damage. You don't actually get the dual wield passives. You do get the charged traits and the glyphs, so I'm using a fire weapon and a poison weapon, both charged. Your backbar weapon doesn't matter at all, except for when you're not in werewolf. I don't have this currently set up for when not in werewolf. This is just purely for when you are in werewolf. So I would recommend probably having some sort of setup where you can do decent damage while not in werewolf form. These bars aren't it. But the werewolf uptime is really good now. They buffed it, so it's much easier to stay in werewolf the whole time. I'm not worried about that whatsoever. I actually changed my mind about sharing a non-werewolf setup just for the skills. So after starting to edit, I decided to come back and throw this in here. Here's how I would start my setup. I have this kind of built around getting ultimate as fast as possible so you can get back to your werewolf form. This is a pretty average front bar Nightblade setup with Debilitate, which is a siphoning ability that gives you some ultimate. Surprise Attack, your main spammable. Relentless Focus, which just is really great damage. Killer's Blade is an execute, and Quick Hook is kind of for the pre-buff part 2. Then on the back bar, Stampede, which goes along with your Maelstrom Greatsword. Then Siphoning Tech, not really for the recovery of resources, but more so for the siphoning passives. Like here, Transfer, casting a siphoning ability while in combat generates 2 ultimate. This effect can occur once every 4 seconds. That can give you a lot of ultimate over time. Also in Siphoning Catalyst, after drinking a potion, you gain 22 ultimate. And then I have Trample on here. I just did disease damage. It could be flame damage or frost damage, whatever kind of trample. But the main deal is the heroism. Grants you major heroism for 10 seconds, generating 3 ultimate every 1.5 seconds. That's a ton of ultimate. And then Shadowy Disguise, which is a nice buff and you can use in pre-buff, and Dark Shade, which is just decent damage and you can use as a pre-buff as well. Then Soul Harvest, because anytime you kill anything, you'll get 10 ultimate. So this is really just focused around alt gen. Okay, back to the werewolf setup. And then I have a 1-piece light monster set, which gives critical chance. So this can be anything like Iceheart, Zon, The Blind, Slimecraw, any of those give 1-piece crit, and this is light. Then Null Arca Jewelry with Bloodthirsty with weapon damage enchants on all 3, and the Shatterpath Signet. This is the newer mythic from update 49, and this just makes so much sense with this build because you stay at over 170 ultimate, which is when this thing really starts to hit hard. Your light and heavy attacks apply a random status effect, and your status effect effect damage is buffed. And one of those status effects is hemorrhaging from bleed damage, and the hemorrhaging just goes crazy. If you look here, it's your third highest DPS at 23. That's crazy to get a status effect as your third highest. So Shatterpath Signet's the way to go. For Mundus, I'm using the Thief. For food on the dummy, I'm using Hearty Garlic Corn Chowder, which is just pure stam. In content, I would use Braised Rabbit Spring Vegetable, which is health and stam. If you're worried about staying in Werewolf longer, you can use the Pack Leader food, which lowers the ultimate cost so you can stay in Werewolf a little bit longer. But again, not worried about that at all. You're going to be able to stay in Werewolf form if you're doing damage. For race, I'm a Dark Elf, and I'd recommend Dark Elf over Khajiit because you don't really need the extra crit damage from Khajiit. So Dark Elf is the way to go here. Things like Redguard and Orc could probably work for this too, but I'd recommend Dark Elf first. For potions, I'm using Heroism Potions, which also helps you stay in Werewolf longer. It's not necessary. You could totally just use Tripots or Weapon Power Pots, whatever you want. For the attributes, 64 into Stamina. For the champion points, I got Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and Exploiter, and then Backstabber if I'm using Null Arca. In content, you could probably switch this out for Wraithful Strikes, because you'll be getting crit damage from some of your support sets in trials. So let me talk through the skills. I have this laid out in a specific order that just helps me think about it. I have what I cast the least on the right, what I cast the most on the left. I don't know if anybody else does this, but this helps my brain. So we start with Ferocious Roar. This skill does a ton of different things. It fears enemies, it sets them off balance. You also get 2 stacks of Blood Hunger, which I'll get into in a little bit. You give Major Courage to your whole team for 20 seconds, and you get a synergy called Feeding Frenzy, which grants 6% damage done and Minor Force for 30 seconds, and Major Prophecy and Savagery. I think basically because you only have 1 bar, these skills have to do a lot, but this is just crazy how much it does. The main thing that I'm concerned about is Feeding Frenzy, giving that 6% more damage. If I'm the only werewolf in a trial and my healers aren't running Major Courage, then I would figure out a way to track just Major Courage, but on my fancy action bar, I remapped this skill to track just Feeding Frenzy synergy so I can see when I have that 6% damage and when I don't. So basically you're hitting this every 30 seconds to proc that synergy and give 6% more damage. The next, Hyrcine's Rage. This heals you and grants you double fury and increases your damage done and taken by up to 12% for 20 seconds. This is based off your health, so if you're 100% health, you get 12% more damage. You also restore some stamina and get Major Brutality and Sorcery and Minor Berserk. So this is just a buff that you're keeping up every 20 seconds. Then you got your dots. Feral Carnage. This causes a bleed over 12 seconds and scales like crazy and execute 400% more damage based on the enemy's missing health. This also can restore stamina and triggers more fury generation. So this is just a really great dot, especially great in execute. Do not let this drop off in execute. It is so good. And then another dot, this is actually a conal. Let me show you. It swipes in front of you, does a pretty decent area, and you deal a chunk of initial damage, but then also bleed damage over 10 seconds, and you heal a little bit for the initial hit. Plus, it grants another stack of Blood Hunger and has a chance of applying Sundered and Hemorrhaging. And then finally, Bloody Gnash. You can actually easily use Bloody Gnash or Rip and Tear. Rip and Tear is nice because it gives Major Breach, so maybe in dungeons this would be a little better. Plus, also this buffs the healing a bit more from your Blood Hungers instead of buffing the damage. So if you need a little bit more healing or you need Major Breach, Rip and Tear is the way to go. Bloody Gnash, for me, did a tiny bit more damage, so that's what I'm going with. This does physical damage up front and then a bleed damage. This consumes your Blood Hunger that you've been stacking to make the initial damage done go up by 25%. And then with this morph, there's a 50% chance to not spend that Blood Hunger. You still get the 25%, but you don't have to lose a stack of Blood Hunger. The second hit deals up to 200% more damage to enemies with less than 25% health, so even more execute damage here. Werewolf just has insane built-in execute. Okay, so Blood Hunger. You can get Blood Hunger in 2 ways. Your Ferocious Roar gives you 2, and you can see I put this in a tracker with Srindar just so you can see it here. Big old 2 with Blood Hunger. You can only stack up to 4, and then you spend them with Gnash, but there's a chance that you don't spend it. You see, I got lucky there and didn't spend it a few times in a row. And then the other way to get Blood Hunger is with Blood Claws. I tried some parses to really prioritize Blood Hunger, but it's only buffing that initial hit, not the bleed damage, and we're doing so much extra bleed damage that really it doesn't matter. You can just kind of forget about Blood Hunger. It's not really really going to affect your damage. You might get lucky and get a parse where you don't use very many of the blood hungers, so you get a little bit more damage, but really it's not worthwhile to care too much about. And then finally, the ultimate, the Werewolf Berserker. You transform into a giant werewolf. While transformed, you gain major berserk. Your light attacks and heavy attacks apply a bleed, and then you can start gaining stacks of fury up to 1,000. Once you get 1,000 fury, you can activate a werewolf ultimate, which is rampage, which increases your damage done and movement speed and removes the cost of werewolf abilities completely. Also, while slotted, your stamina recovery is increased by 15%. Not that you really needed it while in werewolf. The recovery is insane. Fun fact, back in the day, tanks used to slot this not for the werewolf, but just to get that 15% extra stam recuv. For the opener, I was buffing with a couple skills. I did Dark Shade, Quick Cloak, Shadowy Disguise, and then transformed, hit Ferocious Roar, used the synergy, Higher Scene's Rage, and then ran in, and then started my dots, and then spam. And that's really it. That's how simple it is. You're just spamming Nash until one of your dots runs out. And I did mention that I changed my timers a little bit on Fancy Action Bar, so I'll show you what I did. In Fancy Action Bar, which I highly recommend, you can change your ability configuration, and in the tracked effects, I switched Higher Scene's Rage to this Higher Scene's Rage, which actually tracks the 20 seconds a little bit better, and then Ferocious Roar to Feeding Frenzy instead. So that way I can keep track of that synergy and when I need to hit it. Not necessary, but kind of nice quality of life stuff there. So that's it. It's pretty simple. There's the build. Werewolf Nightblade is in-game viable. Real hard mode content is going to see werewolves in the groups. I've heard talk about werewolves running martial knowledge as a support set in groups, but I think that's going to be pretty tricky with not spending stam when you have rampage going and things like that. In order to do that, you'd probably have to bash weave and use stam drain potions. So it might end up being worth it, but the recovery is just so good that it might make that difficult. That's it for the werewolf build. I'll keep testing some things on PTS, and if anything changes, I'll let you know. Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate it. Peace.